Imagine the sound of wind against a wooden roof, soft, steady, almost like breathing. Outside, the world is frozen in silence. Snow gathers along the thatch, and beyond the doorway, the northern sky glows faintly with pale green light. It is winter in the Viking world, and warmth is not found in crackling fires or blazing hearths, but in something quieter, older, and far more human. If you're listening to this tonight, you can let your shoulders relax, your breathing slow, and picture yourself there among people who survived, not with comfort, but with calm endurance. Before we begin, take a deep breath, and if you enjoy these slow journeys through forgotten worlds, you can always close your eyes, follow along, and maybe drift off somewhere between their story and your dreams. Now, let's begin. The Vikings lived closer to the edge of the natural world than almost any civilization before or since. The winters were long, months without sunlight, when the sea froze and even the trees seemed to sleep. In the far north, where Norway meets the Arctic winds, a village could disappear beneath snowdrifts that reached the rooftops. But the people endured, not through luxury, but through rhythm, patience, and the deep knowledge of their land. Contrary to what we imagine, roaring fires, blazing halls, great hearths, many Vikings survived their winters without a true fireplace at all. They lived in longhouses built to trap every breath of heat, where the body warmth of animals, the faint glow of embers, and the closeness of family made the cold bearable. Inside these long, low buildings, life slowed to a quiet pulse. The walls, packed with turf and moss, held in the warmth. The air was thick with the scent of hay, wool, and smoke that never quite escaped through the roof's small vent. Sometimes, a small pit fire burned in the center, but in many cases, the smoke lingered, and the light came not from flames, but from oil lamps, small bowls of seal or fish oil, burning with a wick of twisted moss. The sound of a Viking winter night was not the crackle of wood, but the muffled shuffle of straw beds being turned, the low murmur of conversation, and the breathing of cattle in the dark. Each household was a small world. Families slept close together beneath firs, sometimes several generations in one row. Grandparents, parents, children, all wrapped in warmth, drawn from each other. Above them hung drying herbs, ropes of garlic, and salted meat, the scent of survival itself. In the dim half-light, women mended clothing by touch, fingers guiding needles through thick wool. Men carved small tools by the faint gleam of a lamp, their shadows soft and long against the earthen walls. The rhythm of life did not stop for the cold. It simply slowed, the way a heartbeat steadies in sleep. Outside, the world was harsh and absolute. The snow creaked like wood when stepped on. The fjords froze, locking the boats in place. Wolves roamed the edges of forests, their howls carried over miles of open air. But within, there was a strange peace, a world of stillness where every sound, every whisper, mattered. The secret to Viking endurance was not the denial of hardship, but harmony with it. They did not fight the cold, they folded themselves into it. Their clothing, thick wool, layered with linen and fur, was not simply for warmth, but for breathability, keeping moisture from settling. Their food, dense bread, dried fish, fermented dairy, was designed not for pleasure, but for strength. Each meal was a ritual of patience, grain soaked in water overnight, slowly cooked in the morning's dim light. The stew that simmered all day was never truly finished, ingredients added over time, stretched to feed a dozen or more. The longhouse was both shelter and system, part kitchen, part barn, part bedchamber, and part soul. And when storms raged over the coast, and the wind howled down from the mountains, they listened, not in fear, but in awe. The Vikings saw weather as alive, as sacred. The cold was not an enemy, but a force to be respected, even honored. In sagas and songs, winter was the season of thought. When the sea froze and raiding stopped, men told stories of gods, of voyagers, of ghosts that wandered the white fields. Women told tales of home and hearth, of ancestors and unseen spirits that protected the farm. The nights were endless, but the stories filled them with warmth. To survive without fireplaces meant more than inventiveness, it meant a different way of thinking. Fire was a luxury, but community was essential. The longhouses themselves were marvels of ancient engineering. Imagine a building nearly 70 feet long, its roof sloping low, covered in turf that blended with the landscape. Inside, the floor was divided, one side for the people, the other for animals, cows, goats, sheep. Their breath, their body heat, and even their presence created a living furnace. The temperature might never rise above freezing, but inside, it was enough. Children would play quietly in the straw, tracing patterns in the frost that crept across the wooden beams. Dogs slept near the feet of their owners, and when someone awoke in the middle of the night, they could hear, in that half-darkness, the sigh of wind beyond the walls, the groan of snow shifting on the roof, the heartbeat of the earth itself. The Vikings' winters were not about survival alone. They were about rhythm. Work stopped early, dreams lasted longer, and even the gods seemed to rest. Odin, it was said, wandered the skies in winter, not as a warrior, but as a watcher. Inside, people waited, for dawn, for warmth, for the first thaw that would open the rivers again. And yet, even in this waiting, there was meaning. The Viking world understood something we often forget, that endurance can be quiet, that strength is not always loud or burning bright. Sometimes, it is found in the steady breath shared between two people beneath a fur blanket, while outside, the stars blaze over an endless white horizon. In those long, dark months, there was no clock, no rush, only the slow turning of time itself. And so, night after night, as the storms howled and faded, the people of the north rested in their longhouses together, surviving not by fire, but by faith in one another. In the months before winter, when the last of the sun still lingered over the fjords, and the smell of salt and pine filled the air, every family in the Viking world began to prepare, not with panic, but with a kind of calm, practiced rhythm that had been passed down through generations. They knew that once the snow began to fall in earnest, there would be no turning back. The sea would freeze, the roads would vanish, and the longhouse would become the whole world until spring. The first task was always to insulate, to turn their homes into warm, living shelters that could withstand months of darkness. The walls of the longhouse, built from thick timbers, were lined with turf and packed with moss. Every gap was sealed, every draught tamed. They used mud and straw to reinforce the lower edges, making sure no wind could creep through. When the final coat dried, the building seemed almost to disappear into the earth, a small green mound with smoke breathing softly from its peak. Inside, the floors were layered with straw, then covered with furs and woven mats. The sleeping platforms, built along the sides of the hall, were raised slightly off the ground to stay away from the cold earth. Sometimes families hung thick tapestries or animal hides along the walls, not for decoration, but as insulation. The room darkened, but the warmth held. As the days shortened, they gathered their supplies. Barrels of dried fish and salted meat were stored deep in the corners, away from light. Clay jars filled with butter, cheese, and pickled vegetables were sealed with wax and placed along the inner walls, where the air stayed just cold enough to preserve them. Grain, barley, oats, and rye was their lifeline. It was stored in sacks or wooden chests, sometimes even buried under the floorboards to keep it safe from rodents. Every member of the household had a role. The women spun wool and wove it into thick cloth, cloaks, blankets, and tunics that would keep the cold at bay. The men repaired tools and strengthened the boats for spring. Children gathered moss and dry brush for oil lamps. Even the animals played a part. Their wool, milk, and warmth were treasures in the cold months ahead. When everything was ready, the people would hold a quiet feast, not one of lavishness, but of gratitude. They would gather around a simple table, share what fresh food remained, and give thanks for what they had stored. There was comfort in knowing they were prepared, that the rhythms of their ancestors would see them through. Once the snow arrived, life contracted. The outside world fell silent, blanketed in white. Days became indistinguishable from nights. Inside the longhouse, light came from oil lamps flickering on low wooden tables. The glow was golden and soft, throwing gentle shadows that swayed like slow-moving ghosts across the walls. They kept their spirits warm in ways beyond the physical. Storytelling was not just entertainment, it was survival for the mind. The old sagas and family tales became a fire of their own, passed down in whispers, recited from memory until the youngest could repeat every line. The elders spoke of the gods, of Thor's hammer protecting them from storms, of Freya's promise that spring would always return. The children listened, half dreaming, their imaginations weaving the darkness into myth. Music, too, was a companion. A single-stringed instrument, like the lyre, could fill the hall with gentle sound. Its notes blended with the rhythm of the wind outside, creating something timeless, a melody that felt as if it came from the earth itself. During the long nights, they worked by touch and memory. The women spun yarn by the faint light of oil lamps, their fingers nimble and sure. The men carved handles for tools, small figurines for luck, and ornaments that carried meaning beyond decoration. These were gifts for the gods, for family, or for the simple joy of creation in the stillness of winter. Food, though plain, was comforting. Thick soups made from barley and dried herbs, porridge sweetened with honey when it could be spared, and preserved fish boiled to tenderness. The smell of cooking filled the hall, a sign of life in a frozen land. Each meal was shared, never rushed, often accompanied by laughter or quiet reflection. As days blurred into nights, they marked time by rituals. Each full moon was noted with quiet observance, a reminder that the world beyond still turned. When storms passed, they would step outside, their breath steaming in the air, to see the northern lights shimmer across the sky, silent, unearthly, and full of wonder. For the Vikings, this light was a promise that the gods were watching, that warmth would return. And though the world around them seemed asleep, they knew that the earth was only resting, gathering its strength for spring. Their ingenuity in surviving the cold wasn't only in materials or architecture, it was in their mindset. They accepted nature's rhythm rather than fighting it. When the cold pressed in, they grew still. When light faded, they turned inward to each other, to memory, to faith. Sometimes, the men would craft small charms of bone, or would etch with runes for protection. They would hang them above the doorway, believing they kept spirits of frost and illness away. Women often whispered quiet prayers to Frigg, goddess of home and hearth, asking her to keep the family safe through the dark dot. In those endless weeks of twilight, companionship became warmth. There was no room for pride or distance. Survival demanded closeness. A shared blanket could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. A shared song could lift spirits in ways no fire could. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering everything, fields, boats, and paths, erasing the world into silence. Inside, however, there was life, breath, heartbeat, and human presence. The smell of wool and smoke, the steady rhythm of spinning wheels, the soft murmur of voices in the dark. When the cold became unbearable, they remembered stories of their ancestors, how the first settlers endured even harsher winters. There was pride in that. To endure was to belong. And so, they waited, not impatiently, but with a kind of grace that only comes from deep understanding. They waited for the sound of dripping water from the roof, for the first thaw in the earth, for the cry of seabirds returning. They knew it would come as it always did, and until then, they endured together. In quiet strength, the Viking winter was never about outlasting the cold, it was about living within it. In the stillness, in the long dark, they found peace, purpose, and the heartbeat of a world that refused to fade. In the long, hushed nights of the northern winter, when the stars hung low and bright over the snow-covered world, the Vikings lived within a delicate web of spirit and silence. The world around them was more than land and sky. It was alive, filled with unseen presences that moved through the air, the forests, and even the walls of their homes. In the dark months, when the wind howled like a living creature, it was easy to believe that the gods and spirits were close, listening, watching, walking among them. They did not fear the night, though it was vast and unending. To them, the darkness was a kind of companion, a space where the seen and unseen touched. They believed that every tree had a soul, every rock a memory, every gust of wind a whisper from the old gods. Even the flicker of the oil lamp seemed to move with purpose, as if guided by unseen hands. That as the snow piled high outside, the longhouse became a kind of sacred vessel, half home, half temple. Within its warm shadows, the people told stories not just to entertain but to remember who they were. The elders would speak in low voices. The children curled beside them under firs, as the old tales of creation, gods, and heroes filled the air. They told of the great world tree that connected all realms' roots deep in the underworld, branches stretching into the heavens. In its boughs lived creatures of legend, the eagle who saw all, the squirrel who carried messages, the dragon who gnawed at its roots. The people listened, imagining the vastness of the cosmos, yet finding comfort in the idea that even in the darkest winter, the tree of life still stood strong. When the wind outside grew wild, they said it was the wild hunt, a host of spirits, led by Odin himself, racing across the sky. The sound of rushing wind over the roofs became the echo of ghostly horses, the crack of ice, like the distant call of horns. It was not something to fear, but to respect. They would whisper short blessings, offering quiet thanks for being left untouched by the spectral riders. Dreams, too, were part of their world, messages from beyond, glimpses into what might come. In the quiet of the long nights, when sleep was deep and heavy, they believed the soul could travel. Some said they had seen their ancestors in the dream world, offering advice or warning. Others dreamed of spring, of sunlight and thawing earth, and took it as a sign that the gods still remembered them. They held faith, not in comfort or certainty, but in connection. The gods of their world were not distant. They were reflections of life itself, flawed, powerful, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, but always present. The cold of winter was not punishment. It was a test, a reminder that even in hardship there was beauty. When a child was born in the dark months, it was considered a blessing, proof that life could bloom even under the hardest skies. The family would offer a small bowl of milk to the household spirits, thanking them for protection. These spirits, called land vita, were thought to dwell in the land itself, guardians of the home, the forest, and the fields. To offend them by waste or disrespect was to invite misfortune, so even in their survival, there was reverence. They did not take more wood than they needed. They did not hunt for sport. They moved through their world as guests rather than masters, mindful that everything, the wind, the frost, the ocean had its own will. During the darkest nights, the families would gather around the central hearth, the only open flame allowed to burn. Its glow was sacred. The flicker of light in the stillness was said to carry prayers upward to the gods. They spoke softly, often in song, invoking blessings from Thor to protect the home, or from Freya for love and fertility, or from Odin for wisdom and endurance. The hymns were old, older than memory. Their rhythm matched the rhythm of life itself, slow, steady, eternal. Even those who could not understand every word could feel the meaning in their bones. Sometimes when the air was completely still, the people said they could hear the spirits moving outside, the faint crackle of snow, the sigh of the trees. They would fall silent, listening, not in fear, but in awe. The world was vast, and they were part of it. Winter, in its endless quiet, became a teacher. It showed them humility, patience, and the art of stillness. It stripped away the noise of life, until all that remained was the simple truth of being alive, breath, warmth, companionship, and faith in the return of light. Even their mythology reflected this rhythm of loss and renewal. They believed that one day, the gods themselves would face their own winter, Ragnarok, the twilight of the world. But even in that tale of endings, there was rebirth. After the fire and frost, a new world would rise, green and pure, under a softer sun. For the Vikings, that story was not doom but hope. It meant that nothing truly ended, that each winter was just a part of a larger cycle. The death of the year, the sleep of the land, the silence of the world, all were temporary. Sometimes, when a storm raged too fiercely, families would sit in near darkness and speak the names of their ancestors aloud. It was said that to speak the names of the dead was to keep them alive, to remind the living that they were never alone. The air seemed to hum with invisible company. Children grew up believing that the spirits of their forebears watched over them, not as distant ghosts, but as quiet protectors. Before journeys or battles, they would leave offerings at small shrines, bread, ale, or a carved figure. These gestures of faith were simple but profound, small acts of connection between worlds. The Viking soul was not one of despair, but of endurance. They saw life and death as threads in the same weave, each necessary, each sacred. And so they faced the cold, not with bitterness, but with a calm acceptance that felt almost poetic. When dawn came after a long night, the faint light spilling through cracks in the wood, it felt like a blessing. The people would open the door, step into the icy air, and breathe deeply, feeling the cold sting their lungs, seeing their breath drift upward like smoke. The world was still asleep, but alive. They would look toward the horizon, where the sun barely lifted above the sea, and whisper quiet thanks to the gods, to the earth, to the unseen powers that moved between. Gratitude was warmth, and faith was fire. For the Vikings, winter was not an enemy to survive, but a story to live through, one told in silence, patience, and reverence for all that endured when everything else fell away. In the heart of the long northern winter, when the days were dim and the world seemed carved from ice, what kept the Vikings truly alive was not just their skill or their strength, but each other. Beyond the frozen fjords and the howl of the wind, there was a quieter, more enduring warmth, the warmth of human connection. Inside the longhouses, life pulsed softly beneath the firs and the timbers. The space was shared by families, sometimes extended kin, and even travelers who found themselves caught by early snow. The walls might have been rough, the air thick with smoke, and the scent of wood and wool. But within those walls was safety, a small, beating heart in a frozen world. People learned early that survival in the north was not a solitary act. The cold had a way of humbling even the strongest warrior, the most cunning sailor. No one could endure the endless dark alone. It was through the bonds of kinship and the quiet rituals of community that the Vikings found light when the world offered none. Every evening, families would gather close. The sound of weaving filled the silence, the steady rhythm of wool pulled through loom, of soft breath and patience. Women were the keepers of that rhythm, weaving not only cloth but the very thread of home. They tended the hearth, managed the stores, told stories that soothed children to sleep, and remembered the old songs that connected one generation to the next. The hearth was more than just a place for warmth. It was a symbol of the family's heart. Around it, decisions were made, disputes were settled, and laughter was shared. It was where grief was spoken softly, where love was kindled, and where even the weary could find rest. The flame that flickered in the center of the longhouse was tended carefully by the women, for to let it die was unthinkable, a bad omen, a spiritual coldness no one wished to invite. Neighbors, too, looked after one another. When a storm buried one house in snow, nearby families would dig it out. If food grew short, what little was left was shared. They understood that a single person's misfortune could soon become everyone's. Generosity was not just kindness, it was survival. When a hunter returned with game, he would offer part of it to the elders, to the widows, to those too frail to venture out. It was said that the gods smiled more on those who gave than on those who hoarded. The old women, in turn, would bless the giver with whispered words of luck, small charms of bone or carved wood, meant to protect against hunger and frostbite. The long nights brought not only hardship, but also intimacy. People spoke more, sang more, remembered more. Without sunlight, time seemed to stretch endlessly, giving space for thought and tenderness. Stories grew longer, songs deeper, laughter warmer. They found light in conversation, sometimes loud and joyful, sometimes quiet and reflective. Among the women, there was a particular strength, not the loud, conquering kind, but something softer, deeper. They were the keepers of memory. While men hunted or sailed, it was the women who kept the home alive, who knew the herbs that healed, the rituals that calmed restless spirits, the wisdom that passed from mother to daughter like an unbroken flame. They brewed warm drinks from fermented honey, spiced with herbs to soothe the body. They mended torn clothing, taught children the runes, and recited sagas so old that no one could say where they began. In the dim glow of the hearth, they were both the light and the keepers of it, and when grief came, as it often did in a harsh land, they were the ones who spoke to the silence. They comforted the mourning, wrapped the departed in furs, and sang soft songs to guide their spirits home. In a world ruled by the elements, they were the steady heart that refused to stop beating. Outside, when the cold wind pressed against the walls, the sound of laughter could still sometimes be heard from within. The Vikings had a saying, "Joy shared is twice as bright." Even in the bleakest night, they sought to find reasons for joy. A successful hunt, a new birth, even a story told well could bring smiles and a sense of belonging that no storm could take away. There were winter feasts, too modest, but full of meaning. Families would pool what they could to mark the solstice, the turning of the year, when the days began, at last, to grow longer. They would light small candles in hollowed horns, sing to the sun to return, and thank the gods for seeing them through another season. It was not the grand battles or sea voyages that defined them in these moments, but the quiet acts of care, a shared meal, a mended cloak, a hand on the shoulder. In the frozen months, these gestures became sacred. To the Vikings, kinship was the truest form of fire. It burned unseen but steady, in loyalty, in memory, in the promise that no one would face the dark alone. Their world was built on that promise, and it was stronger than any wall or weapon. Even now, when the winds of the far north sweep across empty fjords and silent valleys, you can almost feel the echo of that warmth, the memory of people who held each other close against the night and believed, with quiet faith, that the sun would rise again. Their homes, humble as they seemed, were marvels of adaptation, quiet fortresses built not from luxury, but from wisdom gathered over generations. A Viking longhouse was not just a shelter. It was an organism, alive with sound, scent, and warmth. Every piece of timber, every layer of turf, had its place and purpose. From the outside, a longhouse appeared almost as part of the earth itself, low and broad, its roof draped with grass and snow, blending into the frozen landscape. The walls were thick, made from interlocked logs or wattle packed with mud and straw, and insulated with layers of moss. Inside, the warmth stayed trapped, humming softly like a heartbeat beneath layers of fur and wood. The air was smoky and sweet, filled with a mingled sense of pine, burning peat, and animal fat lamps. The hearth burned in the center, its smoke curling upward through a narrow opening in the roof, leaving a faint trace of soot along the beams. People grew used to the haze, their eyes adjusting to the dim, their lungs to the thickness of the air. It was not unpleasant, it felt safe, enclosed, a world away from the biting wind just beyond the door. Their beds were simple frames of wood, raised from the cold ground, layered with straw and topped with hides from reindeer, seals, or sheep. The bedding carried the scent of the animals, a mix of earth and salt and warmth that spoke of life preserved. When night fell early, as it often did, with darkness swallowing the afternoon, families huddled close together, conserving body heat beneath shared blankets. The sound of breathing, the creak of timber, the soft crackle of the fire, these were the lullabies of the north. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient and hungry, but within those walls, there was calm. Daily life was dictated by the cold, and every act carried purpose. They rose slowly with the pale morning light, moving from dreams into the muted blue of dawn. Breakfast was simple, thick barley porridge, sometimes mixed with butter or honey, if the stores were kind. On rare mornings, dried fish or leftover meat would be added, a quiet luxury that brought smiles to tired faces. Food was life in winter, every crumb earned through labor and foresight. Before the snow came, families had smoked, dried, and salted their meat and fish, hanging it in cool, dark corners of the longhouse, or burying it in snow-packed pits. Root vegetables, turnips, onions, and leeks were stored in wooden crates under straw to keep them from freezing. In the evenings, the longhouse smelled of simmering broth, bone soup, rich with marrow and herbs. Steam would rise and drift across the room, catching the glow of firelight. It was not extravagant, but it nourished the soul as much as the body. Clothing, too, was crafted with care and layered like armor against the cold. Undergarments of soft linen or wool sat close to the skin, absorbing warmth. Over these came tunics, cloaks, and thick outer garments woven tightly from sheep's wool, naturally water-resistant, dense, and comforting. The women spun the wool through long hours of darkness, their fingers moving by memory, the rhythmic pull of thread, as steady as the heartbeat of the house. They wore boots lined with fur, gloves of seal leather, and hoods that left only the eyes exposed to the elements. The Vikings' relationship with fur was practical, not indulgent. They respected the animals that gave their warmth, often whispering quiet thanks as they worked. Nothing was wasted. Bone became needles and combs, sinew became thread, hides became belts, bags, and bedding. Children helped wherever they could. They fetched water from ice-choked streams, fed the livestock, and kept small fires burning in the corners. Their laughter, high and bright, filled the longhouse with life. Even in the coldest times, they played, carving wooden toys or chasing one another through snowdrifts until their cheeks glowed red. The animals, too, shared their space. Sheep and goats huddled in small pens built against the outer wall of the house, their warmth seeping inward through the wooden boards. The cows, slow and patient, gave milk when they could, their breath steaming into the chill air. The Vikings knew that their animals were not merely property, but partners in survival. At night, after the day's quiet labors were done, the family gathered once again near the fire. The soft flicker of the flames painted the beams in gold and shadow. Someone would hum a tune, low, steady, ancient. Others would join, their voices weaving together like threads in a tapestry. The stories told on those nights were not grand epics of gods and warriors, though those had their place. They were smaller tales, stories of the land, the animals, the spirits said to dwell in the forests and mountains, stories that reminded them they were part of something larger, something enduring. There was a serenity in those evenings, a sense that, even as the world froze outside, something deep within remained alive and bright. The Vikings knew that winter would pass, as it always did. They didn't fight the cold, they lived with it, learned its rhythm, found its quiet beauty. To them, survival was not a desperate act but a dance, a slow, patient, deliberate movement between light and dark, warmth and cold, hunger and plenty. Each season tested them, but also taught them, and so they adapted, not just in body, but in spirit. Theirs was a wisdom born of endurance, of finding comfort in simplicity, and perhaps that is what made them truly remarkable, not their conquests or ships or sagas, but the quiet grace with which they endured the endless winter, together, steadfast, at peace with the cold. When the sun sank early, and the world outside became a quiet stretch of silver and blue, the Vikings turned inward, not just into their homes, but into themselves. Winter, though harsh, became a kind of retreat, a long pause, a time when the noise of work and war softened, and life slowed to the rhythm of breath and firelight. Within the longhouse walls, where shadows swayed across the beams, people found small ways to fill the hours, not with haste, but with purpose. The cold season was not wasted. It was a season of creation. By the hearth, the flickering light illuminated hands at work, weaving, carving, spinning, mending. The women spun wool into thread, their fingers deft and sure. The steady motion of the spindle, the soft pull of fiber, became almost meditative. They hummed quietly as they worked, songs that were older than memory, songs their grandmothers had once sung by other fires. Men, too, turned to craft in those frozen months. Wood, so abundant and familiar, became something sacred under their touch. They carved spoons, bowls, and handles, but also intricate figures of gods and beasts, runes etched into bone and antler. Some carvings told stories, others were protective charms, small tokens hung above doorways or worn around the neck. Each groove of the blade, each curve of the design, seemed to hold warmth against the cold. Children sat nearby, listening, watching. Sometimes they would copy the motions, awkward at first, but proud when a small toy or trinket took shape. The long nights became lessons in patience, the kind of patience that only winter could teach. Outside, the wind keened through the hills, and snow drifted against the door, but inside, there was the sound of creation, quiet, rhythmic, alive. When the work paused, the stories began. The Vikings were a people of words as much as of deeds. In those long winters, storytelling became their truest form of warmth. That the eldest among them, often the grandmother or the seasoned warrior no longer fit for sea, would begin with a slow, familiar cadence. The fire would dim, shadows lengthening across the faces turned toward her. The tale might tell of Odin wandering in disguise through Midgard, of the trickster Loki sowing trouble among the gods, or of Freya's tears that turned to gold. These were not merely entertainments, they were maps of the world, guides to meaning. Through them, the Vikings learned who they were, where they came from, and what it meant to live with honor, to love, to lose, to endure. And when the great myths faded into silence, smaller stories took their place, tales of ancestors, of local spirits, of small miracles in nearby woods. Each story linked them to the land, to one another, and to the vast unseen threads that wove the fabric of their lives. Sometimes the stories were accompanied by song, a simple tune plucked on a lyre or hummed softly in the half-light. The melodies rose and fell like the northern wind, haunting, tender, timeless. They told of voyages across frozen seas, of lovers waiting at hearths, of seasons that came and went like breath. Music filled the longhouse with a kind of warmth no fire could give. It reminded them that beauty could exist, even in hardship, that in stillness there was depth. Craft and story blended seamlessly with reflection. Winter gave the Vikings space to remember. They reflected on the harvest, the hunts, the voyages past. They spoke quietly of the dead, lighting small lamps in their honor, whispering names into the air. In those moments, the boundary between the living and the ancestors felt thin, as if the spirits themselves gathered near the hearth to listen. Even their beliefs about fate, the Norns weaving the threads of every life, seemed more vivid in winter. When the nights stretched endlessly and time felt suspended, it was easy to imagine those great spinners of destiny at work, quietly shaping futures in the dark. And so they wove to not just garments, but meaning. Every stitch, every story, every whispered prayer became a thread in the tapestry of their existence. Some nights were marked by laughter, the kind that rose easily in the safety of warmth and companionship. They shared jokes about the stubborn goat, or the man who claimed he'd caught a fish as long as his arm. Even in such a world of endurance, there was joy, simple, sincere, and free. Other nights brought silence, broken only by the crack of firewood. Silence was not emptiness to them. It was space, a place for thoughts to settle, for gratitude to take root. In those long, silent hours, each person, young and old, carried on their own quiet conversations with memory and hope. They dreamed of spring, of the scent of thawing earth, of sails catching wind again. They imagined fields turning green and rivers rushing free from ice. But they did not resent the winter. They accepted it as part of life's circle. The cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a teacher, one that showed them what truly mattered. Warmth shared, stories told, hands joined in work and love. And so the months passed, not in isolation, but in connection. Every day, they made, they remembered, they believed. In the heart of the Arctic dark, they discovered an inner light that no storm could touch. That was the Viking gift. Not conquest, not power, but balance. To endure the cold and still find beauty. To be still and yet full of life. To live in a world of ice and call it home. As the last moons of winter began to wane, the Vikings felt a subtle stirring in their bones, a shift almost too faint to name. The long silence of snow gave way to the first soft sounds of dripping water, the creak of thawing ice, the faint cries of seabirds returning from far-off coasts. It was the quiet awakening of the earth, and to them, it was nothing less than a miracle. They had survived the great dark once more. Winter's grip loosened reluctantly, clinging to the valleys and the shadowed hills, but the light returned a little longer each day. Inside their longhouses, people began to move with a new rhythm. The fires still burned, but now they burned with anticipation rather than defense. The air carried a scent of damp soil, smoke, and something living beneath it all, the promise of renewal. To the Vikings, this shift in season was not just weather, it was myth made real. They believed that the world itself moved through cycles of death and rebirth, much like their gods. The earth might sleep, but it never truly died. In the darkness, life merely hid, waiting for the sun to call it forth again. And when it returned, the people greeted it as an old friend, long absent, but never forgotten. In those early days of thaw, they celebrated not with grandeur, but with gratitude. Offerings were made, small carvings placed at sacred stones, drops of mead poured into the ground, whispered thanks sent into the wind. The gods of fertility and growth, Freya and Freya, were honored first. Their names were spoken softly, their symbols carved anew into wood and bone. They also looked to Odin, who had hung upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, to gain wisdom through suffering. His story mirrored their own, endurance through hardship, awakening through sacrifice. The Vikings understood this deeply, that wisdom and warmth were born from trials endured. The coming of spring was, in its own way, an act of faith. For months they had lived with scarcity, with hunger, with the endless night pressing upon their spirits. Yet through it all, they had trusted that light would return, and now that faith was rewarded. The fields, once frozen and pale, began to darken with moisture. They would soon be plowed again, oxen dragging wooden blades through the thawed earth, men guiding them with steady hands. The smell of turned soil filled the air, rich and familiar. It was a scent that meant survival. Women scattered seeds, their fingers gentle and sure. Each grain was a hope, a prayer, a promise. Children ran barefoot through the slush, laughing at the absurd joy of warmth on their skin. Chickens clucked again, and the animals stirred in the byres, restless for pasture. In every movement there was gratitude, not loud, not showy, but deep, the kind that lives quietly in the heart and recognizes that life is fragile, precious, and circular. At night, the stories around the fire began to change. They were no longer only of gods enduring the cold or spirits hiding in the snow. Now, they were of return of Balder the Beautiful, whose death had cast the world into winter, rising again to bring peace and light. Of Thor's strength renewed after the frost giants had been driven back to their icy homes. Of the world tree budding once more after the long sleep. In these tales, the Vikings saw themselves the same courage, the same endurance, the same joy at surviving. As the first true spring dawns broke, the fjords glittered again, the ice melting into rippling water that caught the pale sunlight. The people would gather along the shores, standing quietly as the sea regained its color, deep blue and alive. The longboats, which had slept half buried in snow, were pulled back into the open air. The smell of tar and pine filled the mornings as hulls were mended, sails checked, oars repaired. The return of sailing season was another form of rebirth. To the Vikings, the sea was not merely a path, it was a pulse, a living presence. To watch it breathe again after the stillness of winter was like watching the world take its first breath anew. The older ones would smile softly at the sight. They had seen this cycle many times, and yet it never lost its wonder. To them, every spring was a reminder that life was built upon patience, that endurance itself was sacred, and so they feasted, not lavishly, for their stores were still low, but symbolically, flatbread baked on hot stones, the last of the dried meats, and bowls of broth flavored with herbs that had somehow survived in jars through the cold. They sang quietly, sometimes just a few verses carried by a single voice, echoing in the still-chilled air. In those moments, they honored both the hardship behind them and the life ahead. The long darkness had tested them, but it had also made them whole. They had learned again what warmth meant, what hunger taught, what hope truly was. Children listened, wide-eyed, to their elders speak of the balance of things. How one must know the cold to love the sun. How one must face hunger to understand the gift of a full table. These were not lectures, but gentle truths passed down like heirlooms. Even the land itself seemed to breathe differently. The rivers moved with a slow grace, carrying away the meltwater, feeding the valleys. Birds built new nests in the eaves of the longhouses, and the forests began to hum again. Every sound, every ripple, every gust carried the quiet message of continuation. In this, the Vikings found comfort beyond the gods, beyond the myths. They found it in the simple truth that the world, despite all suffering, kept turning. That light always came back. That the cold, however deep, was never forever. And when night returned, softer now, shorter, they lay under their furs and listened to the dripping melt from the roof. They thought of what had been lost, what had endured, and what would bloom again. They did not rush toward spring. They welcomed it gently, like an old friend returning home. For in their hearts, the Vikings knew something profound, that survival was not only strength, but trust. Trust in the rhythm of things, in the patience of nature, in the quiet promise that warmth always follows cold. The Vikings lived close to the pulse of the earth, their lives tied not to the ticking of a clock, but to the movement of sun and moon, to the slow breath of seasons. They did not separate themselves from the world around them. The cold, the storms, the growing green, all of it lived in them, as much as they lived in it. It was this deep understanding, this harmony with the cycles of life and death, that shaped everything they made, believed, and dreamed. Their art, though often simple, carried that truth within it. Each carving, each woven cloth, each song told of change and return. When they carved dragons into the wood of their ships, they weren't merely creating decoration, they were capturing the spirit of motion. The endless dance between danger and safety, chaos and order. The dragon's twisting body was the sea itself, unpredictable but alive, a reminder that all power must be respected. In the quiet months, when snow blanketed the earth and travel was near impossible, their hands turned to craft. Women spun yarn beside the fire, their fingers knowing the rhythm by heart. Men carved small runes from bone or driftwood, symbols of protection or remembrance. These were not idle tasks. They were acts of connection to their gods, to their ancestors, to the land itself, to the Vikings. Impermanence was not something to be feared. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. They knew that ships rotted, homes fell, and lives ended. But from that acceptance came a serenity that few modern souls ever find. Theirs was not the anxious fear of loss, but the calm knowing that what ends will always begin again, in another form, another time. The tales they told reflected this too. Around the hearth, the sagas flowed softly, spoken in voices that carried the weight of centuries. They told of gods who fell and rose again, of worlds destroyed and remade, of heroes whose names outlived their bodies. Even Ragnarok, the great end of all things, was not despair, but renewal. Fire would come, and then water, and from that cleansing would rise a new world, green and young, free of pain. Such beliefs gave them strength in the dark. It let them face each winter not as a punishment, but as a necessary silence before the song. Their homes, too, reflected this balance. A Viking longhouse was both fortress and womb, made of earth, wood, and grass, blending into the landscape as if grown rather than built. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, tallow, and life. Children's laughter echoed against the low rafters. Dogs slept near the door. In the far corner, sacred objects rested, small wooden figures of gods or ancestors, sometimes no more than rough shapes, but alive with meaning. To live like this, so close to nature, so accepting of its moods, shaped the Viking soul. It gave them humility and courage in equal measure. When storms struck at sea, they did not curse the gods. They braced against the wind, guided by instinct and trust. When crops failed, they did not despair. They prepared for leaner days, knowing the next cycle might be kinder. They found poetry in the smallest moments, the way frost formed patterns on a window, how light returned to the horizon after endless dark, how a raven's cry could sound like the voice of a god. Each of these was part of a greater story, one written not by man, but by the turning of the earth itself. The skalds, the Viking poets, captured these truths in verse. Their songs, called Eddas, were slow and rhythmic, often recited to the beat of a drum or the flicker of firelight. The sound lulled listeners into something like a trance. Through their words, the Vikings remembered that life's beauty and its sorrow were inseparable. A poem might speak of a fallen warrior, his sword rusting in the rain, yet end with the gentle image of flowers growing where he fell. Another might tell of a ship swallowed by the sea, only to have its timbers washed ashore and reborn as part of another vessel. The message was always the same: nothing truly ends. Everything changes shape, in their art, their homes, and their hearts. This truth became a comfort. The Vikings did not cling to permanence because they understood it was an illusion. Instead, they celebrated each moment, the warmth of a shared meal, the laughter of kin, the glint of light on snow as fleeting gifts, meant to be cherished precisely because they would not last. Even their funerary rites reflected this peace with impermanence. When a loved one died, they were not mourned with despair but with reverence. The body might be burned upon a pyre, its smoke rising into the grey northern sky. It was believed the spirit rode that smoke toward the afterlife, carried by the wind itself. Ashes fell back to the earth, and so the cycle continued. In this rhythm of life and death, creation and decay, the Vikings found meaning deeper than any single god or saga. Theirs was a wisdom born of endurance, a patient knowing that no winter lasts forever, no storm rages without end. The world would turn again, and so would they. As the years passed, this understanding became the heart of their culture. It shaped how they built, how they sailed, how they told their stories. It was not grand or complicated, just the quiet faith that the world was whole, even in its brokenness. When they stood on the cliffs at dawn and looked out over the grey sea, they saw not emptiness, but continuity, the same waves their ancestors had seen, the same winds that would someday touch their descendants' faces. They were a part of that endless motion, and in that knowing, they found peace. As the centuries turned and the northern winds carried change across the old world, the Vikings, once fierce wanderers of the sea, began to quiet. The sails that had once caught the cold breath of the North Atlantic now rested in harbor. The great age of raids and long voyages slowly gave way to something softer: settlement, cultivation, faith. The old world of Odin and Freya, of mead halls and sagas, began to mingle with a new story, one carried by crosses and scriptures, by monks and kings who spoke of peace and eternal salvation. But even as the new religion spread across Scandinavia, the heart of the old ways did not vanish. It merely changed shape, as everything in their world always did. The Vikings, who had long understood the cycles of life and death, adapted once again. Where once they had offered sacrifices to the gods beneath open skies, they now knelt before carved altars inside wooden churches. Yet in their gestures, in the way they touched the earth, lit candles, or whispered prayers for safe passage, the echoes of the old spirits still lingered. The transformation was not abrupt. For generations, both worlds lived side by side. In the same household, one might find a small cross and a carved hammer of Thor hanging together. Farmers prayed to Christ for fertile fields, yet still left offerings for the land spirits in quiet corners of the woods. When storms struck the coast, some still murmured the names of ancient gods beneath their breath, just in case. The songs, too, carried this merging of old and new. The skalds sang of saints and martyrs, but the rhythms of their verses still beat with the pulse of the sagas. The melodies remained low and slow, echoing through timbered halls, much like the chants once sung to Odin. The land changed as well. Stone churches rose where once stood temples of wood, their spires pointing upward like spears into the grey northern sky. Yet around their foundations wildflowers grew, the same that had bloomed beside the graves of the old gods, and when snow fell across the roof of a church, it looked not so different from the longhouse of an elder, warm and alive within the endless winter. In truth, the Vikings had never been a people bound to names. Whether they called the divine Odin or Christ mattered less than the reverence they carried in their hearts for the sea, the sun, the soil beneath their feet. Their spirituality had always been one of respect, of humility before the great forces that governed existence. So even as the cross replaced the hammer, the essence of their faith, that life was a circle, that endurance was sacred, endured. Their art began to reflect this harmony. Intricate carvings on church doors showed vines winding into dragons, angels sharing space with beasts of myth. The lines flowed together seamlessly, as if the two beliefs had found peace within each other. This was the Viking gift, to take change not as loss, but as transformation. Families that once told sagas of heroes now spoke of saints, yet both were the same at heart, stories of courage, of sacrifice, of the quiet dignity of enduring hardship. The winter feasts continued, only now they were called Christmas, but the feeling was unchanged. The warmth of home against the cold, the shared bread, the flickering of candlelight across familiar faces. Even their ships, though built less for war, remained symbols of passage, vessels of both body and soul. When a Christian Viking died, he was often buried facing the sea, as if still longing for one last voyage. Some graves still carried the shape of a boat, its stones outlining a journey toward eternity. The belief in the beyond, whether Valhalla or heaven, was still there, shimmering softly at the edge of their understanding. By the 12th century, the Viking age had faded into history. The old raiders became farmers, traders, and kings of quiet lands. The world grew smaller, more settled. But within the hearts of their descendants, something ancient still glowed, that same calm acceptance of life's turning wheel. They had always known that no age lasts forever. The longships, the sagas, the gods, all were part of a greater rhythm, one that stretched far beyond human hands. And as new voices sang hymns in wooden chapels, the old songs did not disappear. They simply sank deeper, like roots beneath the snow, feeding the spirit of a people who still lived by endurance, courage, and quiet faith. When winter came, they still lit candles, they still told stories, they still gathered close and waited for spring. For even as faiths changed in centuries past, the Viking soul remained, not in conquest or war, but in the steadfast peace of those who learned to live with the cold, to trust the dawn would always return. And now, as we drift gently to the end of this long northern journey, the winds grow softer, the ice begins to thaw. The story of the Vikings, their winters, their faith, their fires of the heart, settles into stillness, like snow falling over the land they once called home. When we look at the world today, it's easy to think that we have little in common with those people who lived 1,000 years ago, people who warmed themselves by whale oil lamps, who measured time by the stars and the turn of the seasons. Yet, beneath the surface of our modern world, the hum of electricity, the glow of our screens, the comfort of heated rooms, something of them remains. We still gather when the days grow cold. We still light candles when the nights stretched long. And though our walls may be of glass and steel instead of sod and timber, the desire is the same, to feel warmth, to find safety, to share stories that carry us through the dark. The Vikings, in their silent wisdom, understood something we are still learning, that survival is not about domination, but harmony. They lived not apart from nature, but within it. They listened to the wind and the sea, learned from the animals, trusted the rhythm of the earth itself. Their gods were not distant figures in the sky, but reflections of their surroundings, the thunder, the frost, the green breath of the forest dot in them. We see the ancient version of ourselves, humans trying to make meaning from the world around us. They looked at the aurora dancing across the northern sky and saw spirits. We look at it today and see science, yet both fill us with awe. The emotion, that quiet wonder at existence, has never changed, and their resilience, that patient endurance, still echoes through us. Every time we face a long winter, whether of weather or of life itself, we do what they once did. We gather light, we hold close to one another, and we wait for the thaw. We trust that warmth will come again. They remind us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is the silence of those who endure, the mother who mends clothes by dim light, the fisherman who returns home with empty nets but quiet pride, the old man who teaches his grandchildren how to listen to the wind. Their courage was quiet, their heroism simple, and that, perhaps, is why their legacy endures. Even our modern holidays carry traces of their winter fires. The evergreen tree, the exchange of gifts, the feast at the year's end, echoes of ancient rituals once meant to welcome back the sun. The same spirit that filled longhouses with laughter and song now fills our homes with twinkling lights and the smell of baking bread. The names may have changed, but the feeling has not. The Vikings also teach us that every ending is only a transformation. Their gods faded, their kingdoms crumbled, but their spirit flowed onward, through language, through stories, through the unspoken endurance of the human heart. It's there in the quiet beauty of Scandinavian design, in the songs of the North, in the deep respect for balance and simplicity that still defines their descendants today. And if you listen closely, even now, you can hear them in the hush of snow, in the slow crackle of a hearth, in the sigh of the wind against your window at night. Their world may have vanished, but the rhythm of their lives beats on in ours, because we, too, live between seasons of light and dark. We, too, seek warmth in each other's company. We, too, dream of spring during the longest nights. So as you drift now, gently towards sleep, imagine the soft light of a Viking longhouse, the scent of wood smoke and wool, the low hum of voices telling stories beneath a roof of snow. Outside, the world is frozen, but inside, all is well. The wind sighs, the fire glows faintly, someone hums a lullaby, a song that has traveled across 1,000 winters to reach you, and in that moment, the past and present meet the endurance of the Vikings, the calm of the northern night, and the timeless peace that comes from knowing that, like them, we too will see the light return. Rest now, traveler of stories. The fire is low, but it is still burning. The world outside is sleeping, and somewhere, beyond the horizon, dawn is already beginning to rise.